Tyrannies throughout history count on one thing: your submission. That is the #1 way by not stopping evil that you will let evil go on. So joining us later in the program to talk about that issue is author of Romans 13, The True Meaning of Government Submission, Timothy Baldwin. But we're dealing with submission to government and tyranny in other ways, in so many other ways tonight. And that includes massive deception, massive lies, and they just think the more they lie to you, the more they game you, the more they trick you, the more you're going to roll over and let them take over. With that in mind, Big Sis and DHS move on campus in a report from Kurt Nimmo talking about how more than 19 university and college heads from around the country have been tapped for the Homeland Security Advisory Council, which will seek to better recruit from campuses and preach emergency preparedness. The DHS insisted the new council is not about monitoring students and professors, but about making the academic community aware of their surroundings. Yeah, like we need government to tell us which way the sun rises, like we don't know what's going on. No, we got Kurt Haskell and other truth tellers all over this world, and we're watching that government. They're not going to watch us. They're not going to turn us into a Stasi network. Meanwhile, Eric Holder, the Attorney General himself, in plenty of scandal, is arguing that the U.S. can lawfully target American citizens. Of course, they had lawyers under Bush argue that torture is okay, even when it's children. Any decision to use lethal force against a U.S. citizen, even 1 in 10 on murdering Americans, who's become an operational leader of al-Qaeda in a foreign land, is among the gravest that government leaders can face. Although they'll be happy to take those powers from you, the American people can and deserve to be assured their actions taken in their defense are consistent with their values and laws, Holder said, as he argued for taking more and more and more and more rights away from us under the Bill of Rights and Constitution. They are trying to occupy our country, and they want to justify all kinds of violations as common practice, so you just forget about it. Now, in other news, this is a very interesting story. We know there's been lots and lots of war lies. Almost every 20th century United States war began with a false provocation. You could call it a false flag. You could call it a misunderstanding of communication. But all those ships blown up, the USS Maine, the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, the phony Gulf of Tonkin incident, the lies about WMDs, all of them and more have been lies leading us into war. And we predictably have another big lie leading up to Syria. Now, this was not an outright false flag provocation, but it is a propaganda stunt, and they were this time at least caught quite blatantly as Syria Danny is caught staging CNN war propaganda stunt. The footage appears to show the activists coordinating fake gunfire. While waiting to be connected with CNN, Danny says, well, let the gunfire sound then, before subsequently asking someone off camera, did you tell him to get the gunfire ready? An explosion is heard after, but not before, and they've got him in this footage waiting for many minutes, I think up to an hour, waiting to be connected with CNN in an obviously quiet location. Then suddenly, when he's on with CNN, you hear what appears to be the sound of gunfire in the streets as he makes up lies about 200 people killed just in the last hour and literally begs for an Israeli or U.S.-led invasion into Syria, anything to stop them. Just totally caught in propaganda. Let's watch some of that footage right now.
جاهز هذا؟ اضرب. لا اضرب. طلع الكاميرا. على الكاميرا.
And so he says, just let them shoot, and you begin to hear the gunfire and explosion. And then if you watch the rest of the report written by Paul Joseph Watson, you can see the full context of the clip as he goes on CNN and begins to provocate this big dramatic scene. Now, you've got all the other things in the Gulf War. Remember, you got that reporter in front of the fake palm trees pretending he's in a war zone. You've got the incubator babies hoax put forward by the daughter or niece of a Kuwaiti ambassador. You've got fake video news releases, which are actually paid propaganda released as ordinary news. You've got cases like Fox makes Moscow protest with Athens clashes, faking Greece footage and saying it's happening in Russia. You've got lies about Pat Tillman and Jessica Lynch. So many things, the lies about bin Laden, everything just has to be a fake lie to trick us, doesn't it? And I'm sure we'll fall for it again. In other news, U.S. think tank devises plan to sell fake Iran threat, admitting Iran is not a threat to either the U.S. or Israeli security, instead devising a narrative to sell unnecessary war to public. Now, this isn't actually old news that's still current news. Tony Cartalucci has done this report. He also did the reports more than 6 months ago, pointing out this 2009 Brookings Institute policy paper from 2009, which outlays a number of scenarios, not saying if there would be a war with Iran, but which way, when, how, why, what way to get there. Now let's look at the table of contents, because it's got all kinds of things on the table openly discussed in this long document, including disarming Tehran, the military options, going all the way with an invasion, the airstrike option, allowing or encouraging an Israeli military strike. That's Chapter 5 and the focus of this article. You've got topping Tehran with regime change. One way to do it, they propose, is through a velvet revolution, through supporting a popular uprising. They've tried that in many ways. Supporting an Iranian minority and opposition groups, they've tried to do that. The coup, supporting a military move against the regime. All this stuff you see happening throughout the Arab Spring, proposed here in the context of Iran in this 2009 document. And then you've got Tony Cartalucci redoing his analysis in terms of the current fake split where the U.S. and Obama are pretending they don't want to back an Israeli strike against Iran, saying, is it the right time? Should we let sanctions go through? But we've had Paul Craig Roberts and others on just pointing out what a fake split that really is, because of course they would back them. And they discuss in the Brookings Institute document, Which Path to Persia, whether or not it would be okay to have Israel do a unilateral strike against Iran, and pretty much going on to argue that it would backfire on the U.S. because everyone would assume they're working together anyway. So that's what you've got there. Another attempt to create false provocations towards war, and they openly do talk about it. We've covered some of those quotes before. So let's go more into the mind control. Let's go back in history and let's cover some details, some backdrop settings to how we got to this point. And that is through Urian Mason's article, Documents Reveal Rockefeller Foundation Actively Engaged in Mind Control. Mass mind control, that is. And Urian Mason has done a lot of great research. He takes the time to read through the Rockefeller Foundation's old reports. You should too. You're going to stumble across some real gold. And he reports here, in a series of generous grants in the 1940s and 50s extended to Professor Carl I. Hovland of Yale University, the foundation actively funded research into the psychological mechanisms through which communications exert their influence. Hovland himself held key positions on several major national boards, including the Air Force Human Resources Research Institute, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Office of Chief Staff of the U.S. Air Force, and doubtlessly had input in determining their research agendas. Among other things, he is quoted as saying, quote, "You do not have to cause pain to create fear. The human frontal cortex has a primary function in thinking about the future. We are quite skilled at imagining what might happen and experiencing anticipatory emotions. This has proved helpful in our evolution, but it can also cause problems, as anticipated fear of things that may not happen causes stress and others to persuade us." And this is the background research through psychology, through behavioral studies, through animal studies, to figure out how to game us, how to manipulate our emotions, to sell us lies that have a greater importance in the mass society they're trying to put together. They've been doing this in so many ways since the early 1800s. All the research from Hegel and the other psychologists Even the stuff from Jung and Freud, of course, Edward Bernays, being the cousin of Freud, used that research to exploit it in a mass commerce sense and in just general groupthink and brainwash. And so here's an actual quote from that 1954 Rockefeller Foundation document from Professor Hovland. Carl Hovland. With the aid of a new foundation grant, Professor Hovland and his associates plan to give attention to the psychological mechanisms through which communications exert their influence, how the individual deals with the welter of conflicting ideas with which he is constantly bombarded, how wishful thinking and emotional bias affect judgment, and whether the judgment process is transferred from one situation to another are among the problems to be studied. The foundation grant will provide core support for the long-range research program over a 10-year period. And he talks about all kinds of issues here, but among them, the sleeper cell idea that advertising or steered, controlled media speech will have an effect down the road in viewers, especially when they hear it repeated. We're talking about that Overton window concept. Love him or hate him, you got to give credit to Glenn Beck for bringing that out into the open with his book on the topic, because it is important. The Overton window discusses how to take a radical, unacceptable idea and gradually move it into the mainstream. If you take a look at this graphic, you move with a new idea from the unthinkable to the point of radical, to the point of acceptable, to the point of sensible in the mind's public. And by that point, you can get mass acceptance. And that is, in part, what's going on here. But again, they're tying in all the psychological studies on how to find man's breaking point, how to convince him of things, how to get past his logical and primitive mind and use that against him. They've been so sophisticated, and this is a deep area, but it's important just to talk about a few things. Now, more on Carl Hovland. Following Hovland's death, his attitude change program was characterized as the largest single contribution to the field of social communication any man has made. Over 30 years later, it was still deemed the biggest single force within psychology's communication relevant attitude change momentum. He was the gold standard for research in social psychology, according to Timothy Brock, a communications guy from the 90s. And it goes on from there. Now, I want to read just two more quotes from Lord Bertrand Russell, a key spokesman for the elite and a key visionary of the scientific dictatorship they were trying to unfold. This is from a Brent Jessup article in 2008, Behaviorism, Psychoanalysis, and Physiological Manipulation in Education. He says, in part, ordinary men and women will be expected to be